Hello, Alex. Alex, you should look into getting a webcam. It's not expensive. That way you could talk to me. You don't have to even turn your video on. Hello, David.
Hello, how are you?
Good.
Hello, Lou.
Hey, Linda.
Long time no
no see.
Exactly.
Hey, Marlene,
Previous class.
John, Jan, Larry,
Hello.
Barbara, still connecting. Hey, Dan, haven't seen you in a while either.
Hi, Lou. How are you? Sorry, I missed a couple of classes.
Did you get the recordings?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So today we're going to take a look at George Harrison and the way he fits into. Oh, listen, I just sent you lyrics, so you should have in your email box. My apologies. Once again, I had them for the last couple of days organized and just forgot to send them. Got to get in the habit of as soon as I organize them to send them.
Hi there.
Hey, how are you, Barb?
Doing good. Good. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to mute us so we can get started. So, how does George Harrison fit into what we're doing? Well, you could say that the period after the Beatles is certainly midstream for him. Renewal will also be required, but not immediately. Some of you who were with me, I think last summer, we took a, I think, close look at the album All Things Must Pass, which comes out at the end of 1970. And it far surpasses commercially anything that John Lennon or Paul McCartney did as with their first solo album. If my memory serves, it's a #1 album. And it fully reveals something that he'd been exploring and sharing since 1966 in the album Revolver, which is a deepening interest in the spiritual aspect of existence, and in particular, as offered through Hinduism, an embrace of reincarnation. Hinduism is almost too narrow. We'll talk a bit more about it. 1971, in the wake of the success of All Things Must Pass, George Harrison does something at the time quite remarkable. He organizes a benefit concert on very short notice at Madison Square Garden, asks many of his friends to come play, and some are as prestigious in the rock world as you can get. Bob Dylan, who hadn't performed in public in 5 years, came and did a few songs. Eric Clapton Ringo performed. He asked John Lennon to perform, but he made it clear he wanted John alone, not John with Yoko. John was insulted and wouldn't do it. And I'm not sure he asked Paul, because at this moment, Paul McCartney was suing the other Beatles in order to break up the corporation and the partnership. One thing that he was trying to dissolve was the fact that everything each one as an individual earned was to be shared among all the Beatles, whether they earned it as a Beatle or individually. At the moment, this actually, though Harrison was fighting him on this wasn't benefiting Harrison, since he was by far commercially the most successful as a solo act thus far. He was also trying to get rid of the fellow who was a really leech-like business man who had insinuated himself as manager, a man named Alan Klein. So, but we know the concert for Bangladesh was a rather remarkable event. It was the first time that rock musicians got together and put on a performance for free, meaning for free that none of them got paid. None of them were even paid expenses to show up. And all the proceeds were earmarked for charitable distribution for the starvation of the Bangladesh population. A side note, I actually knew the lawyer who was representing Harrison over the next few years, because various parties were not willing to go along with the fact that there was supposed to be no profit taken from this, most particularly the record company. So the money was delayed, diluted, and we know what they say about good intentions. In 1973, he has finally prepared another album for release. So this is 3 years after the first, or 2.5 years, after the release of All Things Must Pass. But before we look at that, I just want to remind us that one of the things that Harrison is bringing into popular song is this overt spiritual message. He brought it to the popular radio with the massive hit that My Sweet Lord was. And with this, I'll play you another song. And I'm going to play you this song as much because it's stripped down in the way it appeared on All Things Must Pass. Phil Spector produced it, and he drowns the song in too many guitars and too much sound. Harrison, I'm actually not sure. I don't know if this has been released. I'm not sure what allowed for, how they stripped away some of the tracks. But listen to this song to remind ourselves of the kind of song, and really for popular music, a unique kind of song that Harrison was writing and that he offered on All Things Must Pass. I've got the lyric to this one song here for you because it is on another sheet. So 1 second as I clear this, move this over for me. Okay, this is A Waiting on You All.
team for you all. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. You don't need a loving, you don't need a bedpan, you don't need a horoscope or a microscope to see the message you're in. If you open up your heart, you'll see what I mean. Been polluted so long, here's the way for you to get clean. By chanting the names of the Lord and you'll be free. The Lord is waiting on you all to awaken and see. By chanting the names of the Lord and you'll be free. The Lord is waiting on you all to awaken and see. You don't need a passport, you don't need no visa, you don't need to designate or to emigrate before you can see Jesus. If you open up your heart, you'll see he's right there, and he always was and will be, to relieve you of all your cares. By chanting the names of the Lord and you'll be free. The Lord is waiting on you all to awaken and see. By chanting the names of the Lord and you'll be free. The Lord is waiting on you all to awaken and see. You don't need no church house, you don't need no temple, you don't need no rosary beads or them books to read to see that you are falling. If you open up your heart, and you see what I mean. You've been kept down so long, someone's thinking that we're all green. While the Pope owns 51% of General Motors, and the stock exchange is the only thing he's qualified to quote us. But the Lord is waiting on you all to awaken and see. By chanting the names of the Lord and you'll be free.
And the Pope owns 51% of General Motors. The record company refused to include that lyric in the lyric. I think what we just heard might be called a basic track. One basic guitar track, drums, bass, a vocal that's not the final vocal, but it's the song stripped down. And for those of you who well acquainted with the song, it gives you a new perspective. So George Harrison's work is filled with this sense of the spirit. Not only, he was also quite capable of the acerbic turn of phrase, a satirical bite. But the next set of songs that he takes him 3 months and that he releases is called Living in the Material World. This comes out in 1973. Now, anybody own that record when it came out? Well, Living in the Material World.
I'm sure I did. I'm sure I did.
Yeah. Who sang that? Dan?
Who sang? Yeah, that's Dan.
It quickly rose to #1 on music charts worldwide. And the album remained at the top of the charts for 9 weeks. So once again, you could not say that about anything Paul McCartney or John Lennon had done up to this point. The songs are distilling essential spiritual concepts to quote this person writing about some of the songs distilled spiritual concepts into phrases so elegant they resemble Vedic sutras. So let's listen to some songs from living in the material world. Let's see. Hang on. I have to bring it up on Spotify. Oh, I know where it is. It's here. Here we go. This song became a #1 single. Now, a couple of things we hear about his style. With All Things Must Pass, with that album, he perfected that electric slide guitar sound that becomes a signature for him. The way he does that, now that's an old blues style of playing, but he doesn't play it like the blues. And with his melodic sense and more unexpected harmony often in a pop song, that sound takes on a very emotional color. You realize that he isn't, and he, I think, never thought of himself as necessarily the greatest singer on the planet. And I think even more certainly than John Lennon, he expresses himself in a way where he's continuing the narrative, the emotional narrative of the song through his really distinctive and beautiful soloing. If you look at the lyric of that song, and again, not to, I'm not trying to preach, nor am I assuming that you're completely ignorant of Eastern philosophical ideas. But if you look here, notice that he took the word, "Oh my Lord," and by conjoining the O and the M of my and holding it for so long, he's essentially chanting in the song, turning it into Om, my Lord, the sacred syllable, Om. The other thing I'll just make a point of saying is it's not contradictory. Most of you probably know to say, give me life, keep me free from birth, because the ultimate goal in the reincarnation cycle is to finally shed all the karma, the lessons that need to be learned, the debts that need to be paid on the earthly plane, and no longer have to come back here. So give me life. It's life on another dimension. Keep me free from birth means let me go to that next level of existence. That's what he's writing about. And in his life, he's doing his best to try to live that. He's going to falter, but he's trying to live it. Now, there's also the side of Harrison. For instance, remember, he's the Beatle who wrote Taxman, one of the most bitter songs that they ever did. Kind of satiric edge, sardonic, about how the British tax system would take 95% of your income at that period of time. So here's a song that clearly is speaking to his bandmates, who in various combinations are suing each other to get out of all of the contracts. And this is called the Sue Me, Sue You Blues. sometimes the Beatles were definitely talking to each other in songs. Paul McCartney seemed to make a reference in a song called Another Day that probably did allude to John Lennon, but John Lennon took it as a major aggression and returned with a song on his next album called How Do You Sleep, directed at Paul McCartney. And so they weren't talking too much to each other outside of their recordings. Although everyone was at this point, I think, still talking to Ringo. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that George does is he starts to produce some recordings for Ringo. He writes for him, writes a couple of songs that became hits. And at a certain point, by 1973, all the other Beatles contributed to one of Ringo's album called Ringo, by writing and performing individually on songs for the album for him, because they were all concerned that upon breaking up, that what was going to happen to Ringo. Now, Ringo at this point was having a lot of commercial success, but they were still participating. Let's get back to a couple of more songs. This is a love song of sorts from Living in the Material World. Now, the title song gets us back to the spiritual realm. And what he's really doing in this song is condensing some lengthy passages from the Bhagavad Gita. We'll talk about those after we hear it. Living in the material world. here, right? Though we started out quite poor, this is a pun. We got Richie on a tour. Richie is Ringo. Remember, his name is Richard Starkey. And he came later into the band, which is why that line is followed up by a couple of bars of a drum solo. The personnel on this album is terrific, but it's not constant on every track. A fellow named Nicky Hopkins is playing piano. Klaus Vormann, who was someone they met back in Hamburg, and who had played bass on All Things Must Pass and on John Lennon's solo album of Plastic Ono Band, is here on bass guitar. He also took that tenor sax solo. The two drummers split the duty, Jim Keltner and Ringo Starr, but I'm not sure who plays on what track. You also heard an Indian instrument in those quieter sections, from the spiritual sky sections, such sweet memories have I, that he's playing a tabla, an Indian percussion instrument. And suddenly that break from the hard driving rock and roll takes us to this memory, so to speak, of the spiritual sky. But then the hard driving rock and roll comes back in as I'm fated for the material world, get frustrated in the material world. They only swell like a tide that could drown me. A fundamental idea of the Bhagavad Gita. And where he says here, I got a lot of work to do to try to get the message through. At this moment, that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to spread this spiritual message. And he hopes that with Lord's grace, he's going to be able to get out of it and not have to come back. These are some songs from this 1973 album, Living in the Material World. One thing that we have to remember about George Harrison is that he had a profound effect on the direction of music. Back in 1968, he does an album of all Indian music. He explored electronic music, but the Indian music, the study with Ravi Shankar, who, by the way, he was studying with Ravi Shankar at the same time in 1967 that Philip Glass was studying with Ravi Shankar. And to quote Philip Glass, Shankar was trying to open a door that would bring a different sensibility to Western music. That door turned out to be much bigger than I thought, Glass said. I thought it would lead to Indian music. Actually, it led to world music and continues to this day. You have to keep in mind that in the mid-60s, if you opened up the Village Voice, there would not be one ad for a yoga teacher. They didn't exist. So it's the Beatles who, through their interest in the Maharishi and their trip to India, bring this Eastern consciousness to the masses in the West. And George was the most devoted, the least wavering, and the only one who really studied Indian music. As Glass said, He and I were entering the same musical door, but from different sides. From my side, it was the world of experimental concert music. And from George's side, it was the world of popular music. It was clear to us that this had historic significance and that the foundations of contemporary music were going to shift. But I was wrong about one thing. I thought it was going to take much longer. But the change happened much more quickly than I expected, and George was at the center of that change. He brought the world's attention to it through his own musicality. So this is musically an assessment of where George is by another, I think, terrific musician, Philip Glass, in 1973. Before I go on, do you have any questions or thoughts?
I just wanted to raise an issue. He was a very talented guitarist, often overlooked. Would you agree?
Definitely, but I also think he was a slower bloomer than Lennon and McCartney on all fronts, as a vocalist, as a songwriter, and even as a guitarist. You know, a lot of the guitar work with the Beatles up through maybe 66 or so, it can be a little stiff. And what he certainly wasn't comfortable doing was improvising much, certainly not on record. But over those last 3 or 4 Beatles albums, his guitar work becomes very distinctive, yet it's really the sound that he found maybe with something in that slide sound that becomes the sound of My Sweet Lord and All Things Must Pass, where suddenly this distinctive melodic character and particular sound is clear. Remember, musicians are thought of a lot about their sound. It's not just what John Coltrane played, it's that no one sounded quite like him. And one of the things George realized was that though he was very close friends with Eric Clapton, he realized he wasn't the kind of virtuosic technician that Clapton had evolved into, and someone who actually was perhaps at his most comfortable at that time with long stretched out solos. He worked his solos out, both with the Beatles and when he's alone, and he found that sound. And he uses it on electric guitar, he uses it on acoustic guitar, he uses it on that dobro, the steel resonating acoustic guitar, and he gives it all sorts of colors. And it's wonderfully melodic, but it's not, so to speak, virtuosic, which I say to his compliment. It's much harder to be a soloist with a strong melodic gift than it is to be a soloist who might virtuosically shred the instrument. Other thoughts or questions? Okay, now, George at this time is extremely successful, 2 #1 albums, but he's doubting himself. He wonders how successful he is at managing what he feels is a spiritual calling. There are critics who are writing that he's simply gone crackers, and that's a quote, from too much meditation. Some friends are feeling disconnected from him, and he's no longer part of a crowd that's going to all-night parties. Some old friends even felt that his enthusiasm in his search for God was becoming a little much, the missionary zeal of it. A fellow who did some string arrangements for some songs on Living in a Material World, John Barham, said George knew better, but being viewed as a weirdo troubled him. He was under stress during the Living in the material world period. I felt that he was going through some kind of crisis. It may have been spiritual. I cannot be sure. Now, part of what was going on was also that his personal life was a mess. It's a lot harder to live according to these precepts than not. So there were infidelities on his part. His closest friend tells him that he's in love with his wife, Patty, his closest friend being Eric Clapton. Things start to get really weird. Patty starts having an affair with the musician Ron Wood. George has an affair with Ringo's wife, Maureen. Ringo, meanwhile, is having all sorts of liaisons with different people. And it's hard to keep drugs out of the equation. It's going to take Ringo till 1980 before he's able to, in his words, kind of clean up and stay sober. John Lennon, we know, had an 18-month period that he called the Lost Weekend in 1973 and 74. Out in Los Angeles, where he's out of control. Yoko's kicked him out, essentially, for a while. And he's drinking and taking drugs in copious amounts. So George is struggling with that as well. One thing that is quite remarkable, even his friends and Lennon and all thought that having an affair with Ringo's wife was going a little too far. I mean, personally, it certainly shatters any naive delusion, that I would have about George's success at this moment and embracing the spiritual ideas that he really believed in and wanted to live by. Something remarkable, though, is that Ringo forgave him as he forgave Eric Clapton. He ends up attending Clapton and Patty's wedding and introduces himself as the husband-in-law. And it was a remarkably amicable divorce. So in some ways, he and Ringo were able to put into practice some of what they were trying to embrace. We also have to remember, Larry sent me one. There are all these articles that have come out in the last week about Joni Mitchell's album Blue, since it's 50 years since its release. And one remark I saw was, remember, she made that in an era when women couldn't even have their own credit cards, right? I remember that with my wife. I remember that we put her name on some of our bills, like the utilities and stuff. So it could be in her name, so she could get her own credit card, which was still hard to get when we were married in the early 1980s. So in the 1970s, Ringo said, look, we had what he called a flat cap attitude embedded from childhood. We were very northern, he said, Northern England. The wives stayed at home and we went to work. We dug the coal and they cooked the dinner. And part of the marriage struggle was that Patty was bridling at that. She was uncomfortable with that. And she also, we forget, there could be a great mini-series called The Beatles' Wives, because what they had to put up was unbelievable. For the most part, it wasn't really safe or wise for them to be hanging out with a lot of other people. They primarily hung out with themselves. But in those last couple of years that the Beatles were slowly breaking up and there was so much tension, the tension was inevitably brought home, but with someone like George Harrison not expressed. So his personal life is in trouble. In August of 1973, he goes to see the Swami Prabhupada. 4 years since the first time they'd met. And he's wanting advice about this idea of his pursuit of God. That he wonders that by infusing his lyrics with with descriptions of the soul or the eternal universe beyond the material world, of earth as a place that from which one has to try to escape the cycle of reincarnation. He's worried that his commitment, and this was a quote was offered, that I'm getting people angry. I'm provoking a bad reaction, George said. The stronger the commitment on my part, the stronger the animosity becomes. You know, sometimes I get the feeling maybe there's one person who finds what I'm trying to say meaningful and 10 people. For them, it doesn't mean anything. And I'm not sure if it all balances out at the end. Maybe if you don't say anything, all of them will be quite friendly. The advice he was given, but when one preaches, he must tell the truth. And we have to pay sometimes in this way. And yet he was finding it hard. He wasn't connecting with his friends, his wife. He felt estranged on this level. As he said, it's like I've reached a point. I have to decide either to slow down and pull back in order to bring these people with me, maybe because I'm not really ready to go myself, or just cut the whole thing off. More and more, the mantra builds up in me, and the effect is so subtle in a way that there's a point where I just can't relate to anybody anymore. The advice he's given, we can't abandon people, especially those who depend on us. Your talent is not ordinary karma. It has a special purpose, and Krishna will help you fulfill it. So for all of his failings and even preachings, it's all quite sincere. And it's something unique that he brings to popular song at this time. 1974, George recorded another album the next year. It's called Dark Horse. And now for the first time, because he's going to tour, he's going to do a national tour, an international tour. And he hadn't done that after All Things Must Pass. And he hadn't done it after living in the material world. His memories of touring with the Beatles by 1966 were so sour that he had just stayed away from it. He planned a 7-week tour, and it got off to a bad start, and it would only get worse. First of all, he wanted to bring Indian music to the world. So he has Ravi Shankar and a troupe of Indian musicians play a long set of Indian classical music as the opening act. The audience wasn't all that into it. The more he told them to chant Krishna, the more he just came across as a zealous preacher and was alienating audiences. Well, and while they were yawning through the Indian music set. Ultimately, the album and the tour earned the worst reviews of George's career. One writer complained that the tracks seemed under-rehearsed, out of tune, unremarkable, lyrics weak. Another just simply declared George as a failure as a singer, a songwriter, and a guitarist. And considering how successful his two previous albums had been, this album and the tour seemed like a serious failure. He further alienated his audience because initially he didn't want to do any Beatles songs. He didn't want to bring that into the mix. And remember, by 74, I think the lawsuits are over, but it's not like everyone is very close. He finally agrees to do a couple of songs at the urgings of some of his musicians, but he changes some of the lyrics to suit how he feels now, which then further offends the audience. And in addition, it's a whole different thing to sing in the studio than it is to go out on tour. And he hadn't been on tour at that point for 8 years, number one. Number two, when he was with the Beatles on tour, they did 25-minute sets, and he maybe sang one song and harmony on others. So suddenly he has to carry this long show. And early on, his voice goes. And after a few weeks, he really can't sing. I mean, as a matter of fact, critics, instead of calling it the Dark Horse tour, we're calling it the Dark Horse, HOARSE tour. So it's just a mess. After this, he will change the direction of his life. As he said, it's very difficult to try to maintain any sort of spiritual equilibrium when you're on the road. So drugs came into his life in a harmful way, alcohol, dealing with the sense of failure. And his marriage is broken up. And now he's trying to get his message out, and in a very literal sense, he's lost his voice. And it's clear that the world is more interested in him as a Beatle than in what he wants to say right now. After Dark Horse, he would not tour again for 20 years. He just decides that he's not going to do that. But what he will do is continue to make albums, though at a slower pace, every few years. But before he could do that, he has to work his way out of a deep depression, out of too much smoking, drinking, some drug use increased, a severe case of hepatitis, and it's a rough time. One of the things that will happen is he'll meet a woman named Olivia Trinidad Arias, and their spiritual beliefs will be in sync, and they will marry and stay married through the end of his life. 1975, he makes an album called Extra Texture. And again, personally, I don't find it very compelling. But in 1976, he makes an album called 33 1/3. And once again, I find some of the songs on that album quite appealing. He's not, in some ways, he has mellowed a bit. Let's listen to a few songs from 33 1/3. Actually, before we do you have any questions or anything about what I've just said? Okay. Let's start with Cracker Box Palace. This is one of my favorite songs of his. Again, it deals with what he believes, but not in a way that's preachy.
I was so young when I was born, my eyes could not yet see. And by the time my first dawn, somebody holding me, they said, I welcome you to Cracker Box Palace. We've been expecting you. You bring such joy in Cracker Box Palace. No matter where you roam, no our love is true. While growing up, we're trying to, not knowing where to start. I looked around for someone who may help reveal my heart. Someone said, while you're a part of Cracker Box Palace, do what the rest don't do. Or face the fact that Cracker Box Palace may have no other choice than to deport you. Welcome you to Cracker Box Palace. We've been expecting you. You bring such joy in Cracker Box Palace. No matter where you roam, no our love is true. It's true, it's true. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. That's all a part of life. And standing in between them all, I met a Mr. Cripe. And he said, I welcome you to Cracker Box Palace. Was not expecting you. That's right on time, but Cracker Box Palace. Know that the Lord is well and inside of you. And we welcome you to Cracker Box Palace. We've been expecting you. You bring such joy in Cracker Box Palace. No matter where you roam, no our love is true. You bring such joy in Cracker Box Palace. No matter where you roam, no our love is true.
Now, one thing to keep in mind was George started to get involved in a lot of other things. By the mid to later 70s, he becomes an avid, not only race car fan, but he ends up funding a whole race car team. More strikingly, he becomes friends with the fellows from Monty Python, John Cleese, Eric Idle, and Terry Gilliam. And I forget which movie it was their first, or perhaps it was Life of Brian, but they couldn't fund it. And so George said he'll fund it. He said that he felt that the Beatles, who had been so influenced by the Peter Cook, Dudley Moore British comedy that were part of what was a program known as the Goon Show, they were influenced by them in their sense of humor. And he said right around the time we broke up, Monty Python emerges. And so he started doing some music for them. He co-wrote and helped them produce one of the funniest bits they ever did about I am a lumberjack, but I'm okay, that song of theirs. He starts to produce movies for them and eventually starts his own small movie studio. But it's that sense of humor, that absurdist kind of sense of humor that Python has, building on the Goons. And you look at the Beatles, some of the videos they had, absolutely absurdist, that attracts him. So I want to show you, because he's ahead of the curve in that MTV, I think, hits the scene by about 1981 or so, if my memory is correct. But the Beatles, by the late 60s, had started to make videos of their songs because they weren't going to perform live, and this was a way still for them, their audience, to stay into a visual contact with them. So take a look at this absurd video that George made to promote Cracker Box Palace. Hang on, let me find it. So that,
John Lennon cameos.
what do you mean?
John Lennon was pushing the baby stroller in the beginning of
No.
the clip. No?
No.
Certainly looked like him.
No, it wasn't. Actually, at this point, he hadn't seen John Lennon a whole lot. John had moved to New York and had really removed himself from everything that was London. And so that wasn't John.
I stand corrected. Thank you.
Sure. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, so I don't want to mislead, but after George's, at the point when he decides not to tour again, he has already bought this mansion with these huge gardens. And he becomes an avid landscape gardener and designer. I'm not sure. I believe that might have been his own estate that we were just seeing, but I'm not 100% positive of that. Now, let's go back to 33 1/3. Once again, here's a song. Hang on, I need to get rid of this. Here's a song from the spiritual side. It's called See Yourself.
It's easier to tell a lie than it is to tell the truth. It's easier to kill a fly than it is to turn it loose. It's easier to criticize somebody else than to see yourself. Ooh. It's easier to give a sigh and be like all the rest. Stand around and crucify while you do your best. It's easier to see the books upon the shelf than to see yourself. Ooh. It's easier to hurt someone and make them cry than it is to try. I got tired of fooling around with other people's lies. Rather I'd find someone that's true. It's easier to say you won't than it is to feel you can. It's easier to drag your feet than it is to be a man. It's easier to look at someone else's well than to see yourself. See yourself. It's easier to see the books upon the shelf than to see yourself. Ooh. It's easier to criticize somebody else than to see yourself.
Now, there was one other mid-1970s issue that he had to deal with that hit him extremely hard. And that is, I think it was in 1974 when he received, so we're back a couple of years again for a moment. This is just something I forgot, but I don't want to leave out. He received notice of a lawsuit for copyright infringement, plagiarism associated with My Sweet Lord. Now, for those of us who grew up listening to the radio in the early 60s, when you heard My Sweet Lord, it was quite likely that you might have thought, wow, that's very similar to He's So Fine by the Chiffons. Is everybody here familiar with He's So Fine? Okay. So, yeah, it's right after the Dark Horse tour. And that just further deepened the depression and this whole period when he really goes down toward the bottom and pulls himself out of it. But kind of in typical George fashion, in the tradition of Taxman or the Sue Me, Sue You blues, George writes a song about it and makes a video about it. So let's take a look. Hang on, let me get the video up. And it's called This Song. And that's the opening of Sugar Pie Honey Bunch. So he's doing that intentionally.
That's great.
So this is the other side of 33 1/3 from 1976, because by 76, he had lost the court case. He had to pay something like $3.5 million in restitution. In 1979, he'll make the last album for him of the 1970s. And this one he simply calls George Harrison. Let's listen to a few songs from George Harrison. Oh, sorry, I gotta share this with you. I'll share, I don't know if you have, oh, I left a song out that I want to play. Yeah, let's listen to this first. In case you'd rather look at the lyrics here.
Day turned black, sky ripped apart, rain for years till it dampened my heart. Cracks in the leaks, the floorboards could rot. About to go down, I'd almost forgot. All I got to do is to love you. All I got to be is be happy. All it's got to take is someone to make it blow away, blow away, blow away. All I got to do is to love you. All I got to be is be happy. All it's got to take is someone to make it blow away, blow away, blow away. Sky cleared up, day turned to bright. Closing both eyes, the head filled with light. Hard to remember the state I was in. Instant amnesia, yanked to the end. All I got to do is to love you. All I got to be is be happy. All it's got to take is someone to make it blow away, blow away, blow away. All I got to do is to love you. All I got to be take is some warmth to make it blow away, blow away, blow away. All I got to do is to love you. All I got to be is be happy. All it's got to take is some warmth to make it blow away, blow away, blow away.
Here's another song from the 1979 album, George Harrison, Not Guilty.
Not guilty of getting in your way while you're trying to steal the day. Not guilty. And I'm not here for the rest. I'm not trying to steal your vest. I'm not trying to be smart. I only want what I can get. I'm really sorry for your aging head, but like you heard me said, I'm not guilty. Street, getting underneath your feet. Not guilty. No use handing me a writ while I'm trying to do my bit. I don't expect to take your heart. I only want what I can get. I'm really sorry that you're underfed, but like you heard me said, I'm not guilty. Not guilty for looking like a freak, making friends with every Sikh. Not guilty astray on the road to Mandalay. I won't upset the apple cart. I only want what I can get. I'm really sorry that you've been misled, but like you heard me said, I'm not guilty.
I just looked it up to make sure that my memory was right, but he included this song on this 1979 album, but it was actually written in 1968. And it was written in response to some of the falling out that occurred with the way John Lennon left India and went after the Maharishi. So the reference to, I won't upset the apple cart, I only want what I can get, is quite specific once understood. It's interesting that he included this song not on All Things Must Pass, but waited. It was recorded for the White Album. It was completed, it was mixed, but not included. Let's conclude tonight with a song that I forgot to add to my playlist, but intended to. And I think it takes a lot of nerve for an artist who had a huge hit with a song called Here Comes the Sun to write a song called Here Comes the Moon. Let's listen. Let me find it and let's listen to it. Because I think he pulled it off, and it's a beautiful song. Why am I not getting it?
Everybody's talking up a storm. Act like they don't notice it, but here it is and here it comes. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Oh yeah. Impulse always quickens when it's full. As it turns my head around me, yes it does, and here it comes. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Oh yeah. God's gift I see that's moving up there to the night. Though dark, the mirror in the sky reflects a soft light. Looks like a little brother to the sun, or mother to the stars at night. And here it is, and here it comes. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Oh yeah. Breath is always taken when it's new. Enhance upon the clouds around it. Yes, it is, and here it comes. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Here comes the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon. Oh yeah.
So this gives you a glimpse of George Harrison from 1973 to 1979, a period where he begins at the top of his popularity and then suffers some setbacks and has to figure out a way for himself to renew. And he does. And one of the ways he does that is by, to some extent, accepting what's true of his nature, which is not to put himself out there as a touring musician, to ultimately live a quieter life in a very comfortable environment, devote himself to things, first and foremost music, but not only. My guess is that you may know a couple of these songs that were on the radio, but that many of these songs, unless you're Larry and you had all these albums, this might be new to you. I don't know, but you tell me, what are your reactions or thoughts?
A lot of them were new to me, and I thought I knew his catalog fairly thoroughly, but a lot of them were new to me.
There was just nothing in there that I could call brilliant or anything anywhere near it. The kind of sounded a lot alike in a certain way.
Huh. Okay. Other reactions or questions?
Yeah, well, I kind of had similar reaction at the time and now as well. It's like after the high point of the late Beatles songs and All Things Must Pass, it just kind of felt like he lost inspiration to me. It felt like it kind of fell into sort of a stasis where he wasn't exploring really new musical ideas that much. And I mean, I liked some of it, and a lot of it was, but it just wasn't as compelling to me as the earlier stuff.
Okay. Yes, Marlene?
I was going to add my 2 cents. I sort of on the same page, and also I've been thinking about everything we've listened to so far, and of all the work we've listened to me, this is the least impressive. I mean, and so, I mean, he's wonderful in so many ways, but this was just for me. This was not there.
All right. George is having a rough time here tonight. David, you want to chime in?
Well, we all seem to be sort of on the same page. This is all pretty new to me. I really just mostly know George as a Beatle, and then a little bit from his early solo career. And I think I like this song and Crackerbox Palace were the ones that really stood out to me tonight. And both of them had a lot of humor, which is something that he did quite successfully there.
Cool.
But it also reminds me that about the same time you were talking about the Dark Horse tour, was this about the time that Bob Dylan found Jesus and went out on tour singing his Christian songs?
That's right. So that starts 1977, 78. Yeah.
I remember that in my hometown, Knoxville, Tennessee, there was apparently a small group of Jesus freaks who loved what Bob Dylan did, and a larger group of old-time Dylan fans who were not at all happy with the concert they heard.
Yeah. Yeah, his concerts turned into like revival meetings. But there are a lot of good songs that he wrote on the 3 albums that were thoroughly devoted to preaching. Anne?
Yes, I was going to say the best part of his, or at least what you've showed tonight, is the video of the courtroom scene. That was brilliant. And I don't know if he orchestrated that whole thing himself, but that to me was worth the whole episode tonight.
Oh, good. All right. Well, I'll chime in. And I don't agree with you guys generally at all. I really like what I played you. I think he has a distinctive voice. I think that as a songwriter, he's uneven. Now, it's very hard for any songwriter to write 10 or 12 good songs for an album. Even the best songwriters don't always succeed at that. John Lennon actually suffered, I think, in his solo work up through 75 from a similar thing, that often half the album is terrific and half the album seems a little less inspired. I think if you compare George Harrison's work to Paul McCartney's, Paul McCartney sometimes had trouble by the mid-1970s and later 1970s getting 2 good songs on an album. So an interesting thing about all of the Beatles as soloists is that there is often an unevenness in their solo work. One of John Lennon's best albums was Double Fantasy in 1980, right before he was killed. But remember, he contributes half of that album, not unlike what his responsibility was with the Beatles. But I like these songs. I wouldn't have taken the time to present them if I didn't. I like what he's about. Yes, it's preachy, but I like what he's writing about. I like that he put it into the popular culture. And sometimes I think that there's a wit about it. I think a song like Cracker Box Palace reflects that. And I don't mean the video, but I love the sentiment of it, and yet it's presented to me in a way that's unsentimental. I like that song Blow Away because it's a pop song, and it's a song that is straightforward, and you might feel it risks being trite. It doesn't strike me that way. So I'm quite comfortable with all of you guys being wrong about George Harrison. It doesn't bother me. But is he as consistent as some other songwriters? Well, one thing to also remember about the 1970s is something I mentioned before, I think in regard to Paul Simon. The period from the mid-70s on, 1975 to the end of the decade, is a bleak period of time for the species known as singer-songwriter. Some of them just go into hiding. Dylan goes deeply into proselytizing religion. Joni Mitchell drives completely off the mainstream, getting deeper and deeper into more abstraction and jazz. Randy Newman's albums are uneven, but like I think Harrison's album, there's always good stuff on them. Paul Simon doesn't make an album for 5 years, from 1975 until One Trick Pony in 1980. It's an interesting time. So, and Larry, I think it addresses something you said, which is an era from roughly, let's say 1962, when Dylan first records, up through 74, 75. Was a rich musical time. And it evolved quickly. The music from 62 to the music of 66, and then 68, and then 70, 71, and so on. It's evolving and changing, getting richer, and so on. I think at a certain point, it had to plateau. And it did. And it plateaued at a point where the culture is also no longer feeding this impulse. This was a hard period to sustain yourself through as a writer and a performer who wanted to do more than just have pop hits. And I think George Harrison is one of those. I also think his work is uneven. I completely skipped Dark Horse. I didn't play you anything from it. I'm not very fond of anything on it. I completely skipped the album that came after that, Extra Texture. I went from 1973 to 76. But again, I'm comfortable standing alone and admiring what it is I do admire about George Harrison. And I like what he sings about. So there we are. Any last thoughts or questions?
Hallelujah.
All right. I'll see you soon. And again, I don't know if you're planning to come or you're interested, but the last Beatles lecture that I'm going to do until October is this coming Sunday on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. See you soon.